Well, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Weil, and thank you also for this opportunity to come here and to speak to you. I spent some of the most formative years of my life here at MTSU, so it really is an honor to be able to return here and to talk to you about some of the experiences that I had here at MTSU and also in my subsequent career. I've had what you might call an unusual journey through academia. I spent my early years being homeschooled, and my mother had set up a bookcase that she had filled with books covering every subject necessary for a complete education K through 12. And I would be responsible every day for going to that bookshelf and pulling out a few books and reading the lessons in them, working the problems at the back of the lessons, doing my math homework, checking my math homework from the teacher's manual, maybe taking some tests, grading the tests. And you might assume, you might assume that I would benefit somehow from this apparent conflict of interest, but actually, at the time, I was completely unfamiliar with the concept of partial credit, let alone extra credit. So in retrospect, I was actually one of my harsher graders. So I continued in this manner for some years until there came a day when I was 13 and I encountered an unusual dilemma. I had finished the last book on the shelf. I wasn't really sure what to do, and neither was my mother. We were, at the time, living in Jackson, Mississippi, and so we started looking into options, looking into the local colleges and universities, trying to find some place that would accept a 13-year-old for studies. And we found that that was surprisingly difficult. They didn't really know what to do with me. Compounding this problem was the fact that I was interested in studying chemistry, and it was especially difficult finding an institution that would be willing to accept a 13-year-old into a college chemistry lab. So we kept looking, and eventually we found one place about half an hour away, Hines Community College in Raymond, Mississippi, and they accepted me and allowed me to take the classes that I needed. So every day, my mother would drive me to Hines Community College. She would drop me off, go into the library, read, or do other work. And then I would do my classwork, work in the chemistry lab. And I have to say, when I finally did get into a college chemistry laboratory, I was a little disappointed. I had already done much more dangerous things in the kitchen. So I continued doing this for about a year and a half, taking classes at Hines, testing out of what I could. And towards the end of that period of time, I reached another dilemma, which was that I had more or less done everything that I could do at the level of a community college. And I needed a longer-term option. Now, at the time, I was still only 15. I couldn't drive. The local colleges still didn't know what to do with me. And the idea of sending me off to a dorm to live didn't really appeal to my mother. So we kept looking for a solution, and as you can probably guess, the answer ended up being Middle Tennessee State University. I was actually born here in Murfreesboro, spent the first 5 years of my life here. My mother graduated from MTSU. My grandfather in the audience taught here for some 40 years. And so this place is really home to me in more ways than one. And the plan was for me to move in with my grandparents, for them to drive me back and forth to school. And so I came here to MTSU. I chose to double major in chemistry and physics. And also, of course, I joined the Honors College. And I can say that really, in the end, it was the Honors College that brought me here to MTSU. And so I had many interesting experiences here at MTSU, some of them associated with my age. It wasn't long before I was TAing for classes filled with people 5, 6, 7 years older than I was. I joined the chemistry club and eventually became president. And one of the things that we would do was to bring in high school students from local high schools or actually travel to the high schools ourselves, and we would present demonstrations to them and teach them chemistry. And of course, I would often, during these events, be surrounded by people who were, in fact, older than I was. So I had many interesting experiences here, but probably one of the experiences that was most important to me in terms of setting me along my future career path was the fact that it was here in the Honors College that I was introduced to the concept of computational chemistry. Every honors student, in order to graduate, of course, has to complete an honors thesis. I was no exception. And so in order to conduct the research, in order to complete that thesis, I chose to work with the Honors College's own Preston McDougall and to do research in the field of computational chemistry. Now, one of the interesting trends that we see in science over the last few decades is that there's been an increased importance of interdisciplinary fields of science. So we see more and more the importance of work that straddles the line between two or more traditional fields of science, more and more importance in the idea of work that combines elements of biology and chemistry, biochemistry, or molecular biology if you prefer, or that combines biology and physics in the form of biophysics, or chemistry and physics, and so on and so forth. And computational chemistry in particular is the field of study that exists at the interface of chemistry and physics and also computer science. And the general idea is that if a chemist is working in the laboratory, it may be that that chemist takes a few chemicals, pours them into a beaker, and expects them to react in a certain way. And sometimes they do, and a lot of the time they don't. And when things don't go as expected, it's not exactly obvious all the time why they didn't go as expected. You can always guess based on what you get out, but it's not always clear how you got what you got. So the job of a computational chemist then becomes, among many other things, helping understand how these chemical processes that happen in a beaker on a chemist's lab bench or many other things, how these things happen. So in order to actually try and understand what happened in that beaker in a laboratory is extraordinarily difficult. We're talking about chemical processes, chemical reactions, things involving atoms and molecules, and things vastly too small for even the most powerful light microscopes to observe. And these processes happen over periods of time that are so extraordinarily short that even if you could see them as they're happening, it would all just be a blur. You wouldn't understand what was happening. So it's extraordinarily difficult to actually observe chemical processes as they happen in the laboratory. There's some ways to do this under certain contexts, but often it's essentially impossible. And so one of the roles of a computational chemist then is to say, well, okay, we know the laws of physics. We know all the laws that govern how atoms and molecules wiggle and jiggle around in a beaker on someone's desk. And so what we should be able to do, in principle, is we should be able to program those laws of physics into a computer and say, okay, here are some atoms and here are some molecules. You know the laws of physics that govern how they wiggle and jiggle around and how they react with one another, so show us how they wiggle and jiggle around and how they react with one another. Now, this is a nice idea in principle, but in practice, if you try to do this, if you just program the laws of physics in their true unblemished form into a computer and say, do it, it's going to take a literal eternity to do this. The laws of physics are hard to apply on a computer. And so the job of a computational chemist then becomes that of saying, how can I cut corners? How can I approximate the laws of physics in such a way that I still keep the essence of them, so that I can still basically see how atoms and molecules wiggle and jiggle around in a beaker, but in a way that I can actually run on a computer? How do I approximate them to the extent that I can actually calculate their effects? And so it was here at MTSU that I became introduced to these concepts as I was working on my honors thesis. Now that's actually not the only way that I encountered the concept of computational chemistry while I was here at MTSU. I also had the benefit while I was here to do an internship at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And Oak Ridge, for those unfamiliar with it, is an institution that was founded during World War II as part of the Manhattan Project. It was actually the organization that was responsible for refining the uranium that was used as part of that project. And since that time, it has expanded immensely in scale. It's now the nation's largest government lab. And it also, at the time that I was there, happened to host the world's largest and most powerful supercomputer. So it was a pretty nice place to be a computational chemist. And I worked there under the direction of a computational chemist named Dr. Robert Harrison. And I worked with him on the development of one particular software program for approximating the laws of physics and applying those approximations to chemical systems. And this particular program was called the Multiresolution Adaptive Numerical Scientific Simulation Program. MADNESS for short. And so I worked on this, and we released it to the general computational community, and people were able then to use this in order to perform various calculations, various simulations of chemical systems. And actually, it was quite well received. Eventually, it went on to be recognized by an R&D 100 award. And so I had the benefit while I was here at MTSU of being introduced to these concepts of computational chemistry that would be essential to me throughout the remainder of my career. That's not the only way in which MTSU and the Honors College in particular significantly contributed to my growth and my professional development. Another thing that was very important to me and to my future success was the fact that the Honors College really helped to ensure that I would be competitive for and able to apply for various national awards. And so, as Dr. Weil mentioned, while I was here, was honored to receive a Goldwater Scholarship, as well as a Phi Kappa Phi Fellowship. I was also recognized in the USA Today All-Academic Team. And probably most importantly, for the purpose of my future career path, I also received a National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship, and that exists for the purpose of paying for all of the expenses associated with graduate school, as well as providing a stipend. So that gave me a real edge then when applying for graduate school. And for the purpose of graduate school, I chose ultimately to attend the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and I joined a computational chemistry research group there led by Dr. Thomas Miller. And while I was there, I worked towards the development of improved methods for approximating the laws of physics, especially for large and complex chemical systems. So it probably is pretty intuitive that if you take a computer and you tell it, okay, here are a bunch of atoms and molecules, show me what happens, show me how they work, show me how they interact with one another. If you do that, it's probably pretty natural to conclude that if you give it more atoms and more molecules, it's going to take the computer longer to give you an answer. The bigger the calculation you give it, the longer it's going to take before it spits out the answer. And that's true. What's probably not so obvious is just how much longer it takes. So let's say we do a really, really simple calculation. Let's say we just want to do a calculation on one water molecule. Right? Chemists often want to know things about water, but they usually want to know about how water interacts with other things. But let's say we just have one little water molecule floating out in space, and we want to know how does that little water molecule wiggle and jiggle around. Now, depending on exactly how we approximate the laws of physics, and depending on what computer we're using, maybe it takes a minute for us to get the answer to that calculation. If we then say, well, I want to know about something a little bigger, or maybe a little bit more interesting, here's 100 water molecules. Show me how those 100 water molecules all wiggle and jiggle around and how they interact with one another. If you say that, then you might assume, well, it's 100 times more water molecules, so it'll take 100 times longer to get the result out, something like an hour and a half. Unfortunately, the laws of physics are much, much crueler than that. And it turns out that, generally speaking, if you try to do this, it's not going to take 100 times longer. It's going to take 1 billion times longer, 1 trillion times longer. The calculation won't take a few hours. It'll take millennia or longer. So this is a real problem for people who want to run real calculations on interesting chemical systems. And there have been lots of techniques to try and get around this issue. Lots of ways that people have tried to develop tricks to let them do bigger calculations on bigger things. And one particular approach basically says, okay, if we had some way of taking that big system of 100 water molecules, or whatever it may be, and dividing it up into smaller calculations. So instead of doing one calculation on 100 water molecules, we did do 100 calculations on one water molecule. if we had some way of doing that and then somehow stitching the results back together in such a way that we learn something about the whole system of 100 water molecules, if you could somehow do that, then a calculation on 100 water molecules really would take only 100 times longer. Now, the problem, of course, is how do you do this? How do you stitch the results back together again? And that's a real challenge. And as a graduate student, what I spent a significant portion of my time doing was developing better ways to accomplish this goal. And actually, we developed a method called the wave function theory and density functional theory exact embedding method, which actually allows one to stitch back those calculations in a way that really doesn't lose you any accuracy. And that was a problem that people had had with these sorts of ideas for a very long time. And so we were able to use this approach to do some calculations that just wouldn't have been possible. Otherwise, we did some calculations involving some of the materials used to build lithium-ion batteries. And that work ended up being featured on the cover of the Journal of Physical Chemistry. And then also, towards the end of my graduate career, I also received an award, an early career award for achievement in high-performance computing from a government supercomputing center called NERSC. And NERSC is a division of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in the San Francisco Bay Area. And as a supercomputing center, it's responsible for providing supercomputing resources to computational chemists and other types of computational scientists all over the world. So that involves providing access to supercomputers, software for running calculations, technical support to help people actually use these systems and the software. And so after NERSC gave me this award, they also invited me to come speak. And I guess they liked what they heard, because afterwards they offered me a job. Actually, they were sufficiently incentivized to try and bring me over that they created a named fellowship program. They specifically the Admiral Grace Murray Hopper postdoctoral fellowship, and I received that position. So I spent a couple of years there at NERSC, and I was primarily working on improving the performance of existing computational chemistry software on supercomputers. So the concept of a supercomputer may seem intimidating, but really, at its most basic, a supercomputer is basically this. You take a whole bunch of regular computers, you wire them together, it's a supercomputer. This is the basic idea. In fact, there was a time when one of the single most powerful supercomputers was actually a whole bunch of PlayStation 3s hooked together. That was a Department of Defense supercomputer. So this is a nice idea in the sense that it gives you potentially a lot of computational power in a fairly straightforward way. The people who actually build these things might not agree that it's straightforward, but the challenge, though, is that most software is written to run on a computer. It's generally not written to run on 10,000 computers. And it's not a simple thing to make that switch. Because if you want to run on 10,000 computers, then that means that you have to say, okay, I'm going to take all the computational work, all the calculations that a particular software program does, and I've got to figure out a way to split up all those calculations into little bits that each different computer works on. So I've got to be able to say, okay, you computer over here, you work on this part of the calculation, and then you over there, you work on this part of the calculation, and so on and so forth. It's a little bit like being the only manager working in a company with 10,000 employees. Figuring out how to manage all of this, how to make sure that everybody gets the right amount of work, trying to make sure that nobody's spending too much time at the water cooler, and so on and so forth. You've got to deal with lots of things in order to make sure that that your calculations actually run efficiently, and that you don't just have one computer toiling away at the problem while 9,999 are just sort of twiddling their thumbs. So it's not an easy thing to do, but my task while I was there at NERSC was to work on improving the performance of, in particular, a program called Quantum Espresso to run on the supercomputer that NERSC was then building, which ended up being the 5th most powerful supercomputer in the world. And over the course of my time there, we managed to improve the speed of the calculations that I was working on by tenfold. So if you think about it this way, if quantum espresso in particular represented about 6% of the calculations that people wanted to perform on this supercomputer. So if you speed up 6% of the calculations on a $100 million supercomputer by a factor of 10, you've just saved the taxpayer a lot of money, or at least given them a bit more bang for their buck. And so what you see in all of this is that computational chemistry is a field where there are many, many challenges. There's the problem of figuring out how do you take the fundamental laws of physics and simplify them in such a way that you can actually do calculations with them. There's the question of how do you then perform those calculations on a computer? How do you program a computer to do those calculations? And then there's the question of, well, how then do you make that software work on a supercomputer? And then there are other questions like, how then do you make it easy for people to use that software? How do you support users who want to do these calculations, and so on and so forth? There are many challenges, and no one's really good at all of these. And if you look at academia, and you think about as a graduate student who wants to graduate, what do you get rewarded for? Well, you get rewarded for doing science. You get rewarded for coming up with cool new ways to approximate the laws of physics. What you are not rewarded for is writing good code. What you are not rewarded for is writing code that runs well on a supercomputer. What you are not rewarded for is helping other people use any code that you've developed as a graduate student. And so what this means is that the academic environment tends to encourage the proliferation of good ideas that are badly implemented. And so recently, the National Science Foundation funded a new organization called the Molecular Sciences Software Institute, which is headquartered at Virginia Tech, and which I recently joined. And the purpose of this organization is to improve the general state of computational chemistry. So our goal is manyfold. One of those goals is to try and improve the programming skills of the next generation of computational chemists, to encourage good programming practices. So we have postdocs and graduate students that we mentor, as well as workshops that we host in order to try and encourage maybe a little bit of an improvement on the part of the people who are writing these codes. We also work directly with existing codes and try to improve them, try to smooth out some of the issues with them, make them easier to use. And the goal of all of this, again, is to make the general state of computational chemistry a little bit better. A few years back, the publication Nature published a list of the top 100 most cited papers in all of science. So this would include chemistry, physics, biology, medicine, geology, et cetera, et cetera. And so they published a list of the 100 most cited, that is to say the 100 papers that other researchers had most frequently referred to in their own work. And if you look at this list, what you see is actually a little surprising. You might expect to see lots of huge breakthroughs in science. There's not so much of that, actually. What you see is, first of all, there's actually a lot of computational chemistry papers there. We get something like 30 or 40 of these top 100 papers. So we're very well represented there. But then of those computational chemistry papers, a great many of them involve the development of simple little tools that help a lot of people. That's what often is most impactful in the realm of computational chemistry. Sometimes there are huge breakthroughs, but often there are simply things that make life a little bit easier for a lot of people. And that can have a bigger impact than anything. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do at MULSI, is to try and make it a little bit easier for computational chemists to do their work, and maybe make it a little bit easier to figure out what's going on in a chemist beaker on a desk somewhere. Thank you for your attention.